Welcome to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines for over 25 years. Online at thepulp.net. In this Pulp Event podcast, Laurie Powers interviews author and pulp historian Will Murray. It's titled The Wild Adventures of Will Murray, a PulpFest Profile. Laurie is author of Queen of the Pulps, The Reign of Daisy Bacon and Love Story magazine. Will is an author and pulp historian, whose latest book is Master of Mystery, The Rise of the Shadow. This event was recorded on Saturday, August 21, 2021, at PulpFest 2021 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
I think I'll start out with just asking you some introductory questions, so if anybody's not familiar with your work, which I can't imagine, but probably should anyway. So you're best well known for your work with the Doc Savage character. Can you tell us a little bit how you got involved with that and what attracted you to that work?
Well, I was 15 and I had started buying paperback books, having grown up on Marvel and DC Comics, and one snowy night I went out looking for something new to read. I'd started reading Edgar Rice Burroughs and a few other writers like that, but I didn't have a concept of pulp writers. You know, I was just sort of buying whatever looked interesting, and I went out and I saw a Doc Savage novel, and I'd seen them before, and this time something just struck me, and I just picked it up and I bought it, and I said, oh, these are really good books. So I started buying Doc Savage intensively, and The Shadow reprints soon followed, and so did G8 and The Spider, and I was buying some of the Weird Tales writers like H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard. So I was somehow gravitating towards pulp writers in paperback without having a concept of the pulp magazine world. And those were the door openers: Edgar Rice Burroughs, Doc Savage, The Shadow, etc., etc., etc. And it wasn't long before I decided I wanted to read every Doc Savage, even though I didn't know there were nearly 200 of them. And so that soon became a quest to buy the pulp magazines, because Bantam Books was reprinting them at a certain pace, and I was wanting to read them at a quicker pace. And so that's how I fell into it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. And then what made you decide, at what point, to start authoring some of these novels?
Well, first I started writing fanzine articles on Doc Savage, The Shadow, all this stuff. And the thing that triggered me writing Doc Savage, which had never crossed my mind, was I visited Mrs. Dent, Lester Dent's widow, in her house in La Plata, Missouri, around 1979, I think it was, maybe 1978. I'll have to look it up. And I had sold an unpublished Doc Savage. I had agented an unpublished Doc Savage novel, The Red Spider, to Bantam Books in 1978. Made her some money, so she appointed me her literary agent for the estate of Lester Dent. So I went out to visit her for the first time, and I went through Lester Dent's manuscripts, and the first thing she showed me was this old gray or dark green filing cabinet, a typical filing cabinet they still make. And she said, where do you want to start? And I said, with Doc Savage. She said, well, start with that one. And I pulled out the first drawer, and I can remember the smell of the old paper, and I was going through the manuscripts, and I was seeing the outlines for the first time, and I went systematically through every Doc Savage manuscript in that particular filing cabinet, and I came across Doc Savage outline number 22, Python Isle. And I said, there's no Doc Savage titled Python Isle. What is this? And then beneath it was another outline, Doc Savage outline 22, The Sea Magician. And I said, well, I read that one. I never heard of this one.
And they were outlines.
And they were outlined, 10-page outlines. And I read it, and I said, this is a good story. But you never wrote it. And Mrs. Dent allowed me to make a photocopy, because it was a little treasure to me, an unwritten Doc Savage novel. And over time, a myriad of months, I went from studying this to saying, I wish he'd written this, to I wish he'd at least written the first few chapters, I'd like to read the first few chapters, to someone should turn this into a book, to maybe I should. So she gave me permission, and I wrote a draft, and I got Bantam Books interested, And they were thinking of publishing it, but then they said, well, we want to finish reprinting the series. And so 11 years later, they came back to say, okay, we're ready. We're finishing the series. We've got Philip Jose Farmer writing a Doc Savage novel. We want you to write 3 more. So we start with Python Out, which I'd already submitted to them as a manuscript. And long story short, I sort of fell into it, but it took 11 years to go from, writing a draft to
It took 11 years for them to get back to you then.
11 years, which is not completely unusual in publishing. In the meantime, I've been writing ghostwriting the Destroyer paperback series, and I did at that point, I'd probably done 25 or 30 of them.
Oh, wow, okay.
So my writing career went on without Doc until Bantam Books sort of caught up with me again.
Okay, so what were some of the challenges that you faced when you were finishing these new Lester Den Doc Savages?
It depends on what I was working on. If I had a full outline, I would just try to follow the outline as best I could. If I had a half an outline or parts of outlines or unfinished manuscripts, it's like, okay, he started this book, he went off track, he decided he would start the book over, he went in a different direction, so we have a completely different opening to a book he finished with in a different way. So what can I do with this? Well, I've got to change character names and some story elements, and I got to invent something that fits this so the story can go in a fresh direction. And that was a big challenge, but that was also a lot of fun, because in typing the manuscripts over, I'm getting into Lester Dent's mental machinery, and I'm understanding how he constructs sentences and words. And so whenever I write a Doc Savage from a manuscript fragment or outline, I'm always retyping it from scratch so I can plug into the whole Lester Dent mindset. And I remember when Bantam said, let's do more. We did them for a couple, 3 years. And I said, well, I wasn't planning to do more than 3, but let me see what I have. And I always wanted to work with Lester Dent material. So I would work from an outline that he wrote for a book he never finished or whatever. Or I would, here's a Doc Savage outline that he wrote, 3 outlined chapters for that he just didn't use, he just discarded. And here's a whole back of a book he outlined that he just went off in a different direction. I can take these 4 chapters here and this last 12 chapters here or 10 chapters, and I said, all I got to do is write a middle. Or all I got to do is write from that outline, write a middle, and finish it from that outline. And since he was kind of a modular writer, he wrote the formula, you could actually do that fairly easily if you had the right components. So, but a lot of it is just getting the style down, using his vocabulary as opposed to someone else's vocabulary or my vocabulary, because I feel if you love a character like Doc Savage or Tarzan or Spider or any of these guys who have a strong writer behind them, you really want part of the experience is the writer's style, his sensibility, and how he writes a character. For instance, I read a Tarzan short story not long ago where it starts off Tarzan has already been captured, he's in a cage on a boat. And even though Edgar Rice Burroughs didn't say it was Tarzan, and Tarzan wasn't really speaking, you could tell it was Tarzan because of the sort of the sense of how he would write about Tarzan. You realize, okay, this is Tarzan. And look how he's establishing that this is Tarzan with almost no effort. Because if you know Edgar Rice Burroughs' style and you know Tarzan, there's no question that that's Tarzan. But another reader would not know who that character was. So getting the essence, the spirit of how the writer brings his character alive, to me is a big challenge, but it's the part of it that I really like.
Yeah, it's most very gratifying.
Yeah, because I don't know that anybody wants to read a Will Murray Doc Savage or a Will Murray Tarzan.
Well,
they might, but that's not what I want to write.
Right. That's probably why they've been so popular, as you've been able to copy that style. So you touched on some of the other characters that you've been working with over the last few years. Why don't you talk about those a little bit? Well,
the best way to talk about that is when I started the Wild Adventures, it was with Doc Savage. We had 2 manuscripts, 2 cover paintings by Joe DeVito, who did these wonderful paintings here. And we didn't know how successful they'd be. So we did 2 Doc Savages. They sold. There was a demand for more. We kept going. And after a couple of years, we were staring at the 80th anniversary of Doc Savage, and I was talking to Joe DeVito, and I said, out of the outlines I have, I gotta come up with one, and you gotta come up with a cover that's worthy of the 80th anniversary. And Joe said, well, you know I own the rights to King Kong. And I knew that, I just didn't connect the dots in terms of something we could do together. And I said, well, could we do Doc meets Tarzan? He said, yes, we could, I could make it happen. So I had to clear it with Condé Nast, and once I did, we were doing Doc Savage meets Tarzan, a dream project.
You mean King Kong.
King Kong, sorry. And so we did that. And the next year, I started getting hints that maybe you should try Tarzan, because you're doing so well with these characters. And in fact, when I wrote Skull Island, which is my Doc Savage meets King Kong,
which is an awesome book,
I kind of had a little Burroughs flavor in it, because I didn't want to do the 1930s Kenneth Robeson style, because it was 1930s style. So who was writing 20 years before, who fit, was Edgar Rice Burroughs. So I kind of give it a little Burroughs flavor, especially since it involved dinosaurs and jungle. It wasn't hard. So we did Skull Island. And then I started hearing from people suggesting, you should reach out to Edgar Rice Burroughs. Maybe you could do a Tarzan. So Joe had worked with them, doing a sculpture and other things. So we did. And they were amenable to it. So suddenly we're doing Tarzan, completely unexpected. And since we had King Kong, let's do Tarzan meets King Kong. So that was my second book with Tarzan. And then we were coming up on a contract renewal on Doc Savage, and new people were in place. And I said, can we do The Shadow meets Doc Savage? And they said, sure. Can we do Tarzan? I mean, can we do Pat Savage as her own book? Sure. Pat Savage is Doc Savage's cousin, so they let me do that. And the next thing you know, we're doing a sequel to The Shadow meets Doc that was Empire of Doom. So I did two of those. And I'm finding the crossovers are selling better than regular books, and people are more excited and they're more promotable. So I said, well, okay, what can we do for crossovers? And I'd always loved the spider. Okay? And I knew Joel Freeman, who owned the Spider at that time, and Matt Mooring, my co-publisher, was very friendly with Joel. So Matt sort of opened the door in the sense of feeling him out. And I talked to Joel, and Joel was very excited about me bringing back the Spider. But he said, can you bring back G8? Can you bring back Operator 5? Can you bring back other characters? I said, yeah, if we do crossovers. So we cut a deal to do 3 books, and they would be crossovers, and I would bring out every one of the characters that Joel wanted brought to the forefront again. So we ended up doing 2 spiders, and there's this 3rd one I'm working on now, and Joel wanted every character possible reintroduced, so he suggested we do in the back of the hardcovers a short story with some of the characters that didn't fit the lead novel. So all of a sudden I'm full of characters, having to revive them. And
how do you juggle all these?
Well, I mean, it's a mindset thing. You have to, if you're going to write The Spider, you should reread some spiders, or read or reread some spiders. If you can write Doc Savage, you got to read them and plug into that. So you can't just switch. You can't just, you got to go into that mindset and stay there till the book is done. So we're doing The Spider now. Then we got the right to do Tarzan meets John Carter. So that was Tarzan, Conqueror of Mars. Now we're talking about a sequel, and so it just snowballed, and the core audience really liked these books. They're not in bookstores, we're not making a lot of money, but the licensors are happy. I'm happy. I'm doing books that would have been dream projects when I discovered this stuff. Would be anybody's dream project. People are talking about Doc Savage meeting King Kong since 1933. They've been talking about Tarzan meets John Carter since 100 years ago. And just through these weird coincidences, all these projects dropped into my lap. King Kong meets Tarzan. The creator of King Kong wanted to do that as a movie in 1935. He couldn't get the rights to Tarzan, and his own rights to King Kong were kind of muddy. But that would have happened in 1935. It would have been a classic. It took until 2016 for me to do it. And it's like, it was just amazing, It was amazing. I remember Joe DeVito saying, we should do King Kong meets Tarzan. And I said, well, I just did Skull Island. I don't know if I want to write about dinosaurs in Skull Island again. And I said, yeah, maybe, but I'm not really feeling a great story here. Then Burroughs' birthday came around. It was September 1, and the weekend it came around, I was seeing all this Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff on Facebook, and I started thinking about it. Yeah, King Kong meets Tarzan. What can I do with that isn't just going back to Skull Island? And I remember, it just popped into my head that in the movie they knocked King Kong out with gas bombs, and they put him on a boat, and the next thing you know, he's in New York. I said, something must have happened in the middle. There was like, they had to get this monkey all the way halfway across the planet. It's like, there's got to be a story there. I said, well, if they take him around Africa and there's a storm or there's a problem, and then King Kong escapes, that's how he meets Tarzan. You know, instead of Tarzan going to Skull Island, which they tried to do as a graphic novel about 20 years ago and they couldn't clear the rights. I think Frank Cho and someone else was going to, maybe Dave Stevens, the artist. They couldn't clear the rights. And so they didn't do it, but they were going to do Tarzan on Skull Island, which is a good idea. But I thought my idea was a great idea because it fit the original story and it was a missing piece of that story, but also it allowed for Tarzan to interact with King Kong in his own environment, and King Kong to be out of his environment and to be confused and to be, you know, not at his best. So we could equalize the battle between them. You know, if Kong has been half starved and he's in an unfamiliar place, he's going to be at a disadvantage. And Tarzan, seeing this as his jungle, says, "We got to get this monkey out of my jungle. He's too big. He's wrecking everything." So, you know, so it created a balance there that wouldn't have existed on Skull Island. You know, because Tarzan would be fighting dinosaurs as well as King Kong, and there's a lot to do on Skull Island. It's a little overwhelming.
Yeah. So, just a little bit of a shift here. Let's talk about Sherlock Holmes for a minute.
About 10 or 12 years ago, Moonstone Books asked me to do a Sherlock Holmes short story for a book called the Sherlock Holmes Crossover Casebook. And I had him meet Richard Henry Savage, the inspiration for Doc Savage, the real life inspiration, because they were contemporaries. Or they would have been if Sherlock Holmes had been real. And so I wrote that story, and it was good, but I always wanted to write a standalone Sherlock Holmes story. And a few years later, another publisher asked me to do, you know, Sherlock Holmes meeting, you know, another character, and I did Herbert West from, you know, H.P. Lovecraft. So I did that, and I still couldn't write a Sherlock Holmes story that was just a Sherlock Holmes story until David Markham, from who edits the MX Sherlock Holmes anthology, said, "Would you write me a Sherlock Holmes story?" I said, "Love to," because it had no strings, no preconditions. So I wrote a story. He liked it. 6 months later, he says, "Can you do another?" I did it. A year later, he's putting me in touch with Belanger Books. "Can you write a story for our anthologies?" And now I'm in this position where I'm writing 6, 7 Sherlock Holmes stories a year because these anthologies keep coming out. So they started accumulating, so I said, let's collect them and do a book. The Wild Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. It's part of our Wild Adventures series. Fortunately, Joe DeVito had a Sherlock Holmes painting that he painted for a publisher who never used it. So we had a painting all set. You know, so we did that last year, and I'm doing volume 2 once I collect a few more stories. So I'm up to 32 Sherlock Holmes stories, and it's like, somebody's got to get a grip here. I can't keep doing this. You know, I love the character, but I can't, you know, I don't want to end up writing more Sherlock Holmes stories than Conan Doyle.
Well, it's pretty popular, though.
Yeah, it's popular. I like writing them, but, you know, some are easy than others, and there's other things I want to write, too.
Speaking of which, what about, like, are you going to do any more Pat Savage?
I would love to if Condé Nast would let me. I have a plot for another one, maybe 2, but right now it's not on the boards. But that doesn't mean I've given up. It just means that I got to wait for an opportunity where they might let me do that. And, you know, maybe they will, maybe they won't.
Okay. So one thing I've always been curious about is the path of Squirrel Girl. So why don't you tell us a story about that?
I wish I could remember how I created Squirrel Girl in more detail than I do, because people have brought things to my attention that I'd forgotten. Recently, someone pointed to a Destroyer novel I wrote in 3 years before I created Squirrel Girl for Marvel, and I'd had the characters running through this Disneyland type environment where they had these fictitious, you know, cartoon characters as, you know, animatronic things and also as, greeters in costume. And I had a squirrel girl in that, and a squirrel girl Ferris wheel. And I said, I didn't know I was thinking of squirrel girl that early. And it's like, well, I guess I was. What happened was I had an editor at Marvel when I was writing the Destroyer Black and White magazine, which was based on the Destroyer books I was writing at that time. And he said, would you write me a fill-in Iron Man story? And I said, sure. And I came up with this squirrel girl idea, which is partly based on the fact that I had squirrels in my attic and I was constantly dealing with them. So I was observing their habits. And partly because I had an ex-girlfriend who was a comics fan who would rescue animals. And she once helped me rescue a squirrel that had fallen out of one of my trees. And the thing that I think was the trigger, because someone reminded me of this story and I completely forgot it, is I'd gone to church with this girl one Sunday. And unbeknownst to me, she had rescued a baby squirrel somewhere in the recent past. She brought it to church and tucked into her coat. It was winter. So I'm in the middle of service, and I look over, and this little squirrel head pops out of her coat and looks around. I didn't say anything. What could I say? And on the way out, she let it drink from the holy water, which was a little freaky. And and either I or a friend of mine who knew her hung the name Squirrel Girl on her nickname without telling her. It was kind of like back door kind of nickname. And I guess the wheels started turning. And maybe somewhere along the line I would have created her even if I didn't do it for Marvel. So I did a Marvel story, comic story, Iron Man story. It was published, and Squirrel Girl had a kind of impact where people either loved her or hated her. And Marvel thought she was a little too frivolous for their universe, and they said, we're not going to use her again. But then they revived her, and she became a hit. And I always knew she was going to be popular if they just gave her a chance. Mm-hmm. So I created her as a way to introduce a character into the Marvel Universe that was different. The Marvel Universe, this was 1989, it was getting grim and gritty, a little too sexualized, and I grew up on Marvel Comics in the 60s. I wanted to bring back the fun and the good nature and the humor. So Squirrel Girl was meant to be a fun character, but also had kind of heart and good intentions. And that's roughly how I remember she began, but there's probably more to it because I keep getting new pieces of the puzzle.
So what's happened with her since then?
Well, she was revived, and then she started to snowball, and they gave her own magazine, The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, and they got a writer named Ryan North to write it, and they got an artist named Erica Henderson to draw it, and Erica Henderson does it very cartoony. And even though it's not Marvel style, it became a hit. And one of the interesting things is Erica Henderson's late father was C.J. Henderson, who used to come to these kind of conventions and wrote books. He wrote the first Spider novel since the 1940s, and I wrote the next bunch of Spider novels since the 1940s. I knew him just casually. So Squirrel Girl's main artist, Erica Henderson, has a pulp connection through her father. And she also lives in the greater Boston area where I do, though I've never met her. And the Squirrel Girl comic, Squirrel Girl became kind of a female empowerment character. Mm-hmm. They did a couple of young adult novels. I didn't write them, Shannon Hale did. And I did her originally with Steve Ditko, who didn't want to do the character ever again. He thought she was too frivolous or something. And she's just taken on a life of her own. Now there's Squirrel Girl toys, and Squirrel Girl, she's in a lot of video games as a playable character. And the joke about Squirrel Girl that evolved after I wrote my first story is she can mysteriously beat anyone. She doesn't always use physical strength or whatever. Sometimes she uses persuasion, but she's unbeatable because no one's been able to take her. And that's kind of the joke, but also the power of her.
I want to go back a little bit to what you were mentioning earlier about the Destroyer novels and when you started to do a lot of research for these works. You mentioned before about doing a lot of travel. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Well, when I was first writing, it's probably the early 80s in terms of when I started writing professionally, someone I had known for a while through the fanzine and semi-professional circuit, Dave McDonald, he went from Super Graphics Media Scene magazine to Starlog magazine, which I'd never read. And he became an assistant editor and started throwing me a little bit of work, you know. And I think the first big thing I got to do was an article on the Doc Savage's 60th anniversary for their Comic Scene magazine. And Dave eventually got promoted to editor of Starlog and Fangoria. And one day he reached out to me and said they're making a movie out of the Destroyer down in Mexico City. Do you want to cover it? Well, covering a movie is something I never thought of. I'd interviewed people. I'd interviewed Walter Gibson, pulp guys, comic guys. So I knew how to interview people, knew how to write up the interview. But traveling to a movie set and interviewing actors and directors and technical people, it never was in my wheelhouse. So I thought about it and I said, okay, I'll do it. So we got a ticket down to Mexico City and I was part of a junket and we went up, we watched them film and we interviewed people, and a book I'd written on the Destroyer was being used as a source book on that movie, so I was a little bit of a celebrity on that movie. So going to Mexico, that was like the first of 3 times I went to Mexico to cover movies down at the old Churubusco studios. Well, I did a good enough job that Dave, the next year or 6 months later, said, would you, would you cover The Return of Swamp Thing? I think that was the second one, I'm not sure. I did that. Then there was some junket involving 3 movies, Trick or Treat, which was a horror movie, King Kong Lives, and then The Evil Dead 2, which is now a classic. And he sent me down to North Carolina for those 3 movies, so I spent a week going from set to set. And, you know, I fell into this career writing for this magazine group of going on movie sets, and, you know, went back to Mexico for The Mask of Zorro, which is a pulp movie, and I was on The Shadow. That was being filmed in LA, the only time I went to LA for a movie. And I spent 2 weeks on the set there watching them film and observing that because I had the Shadow background and they ended up having me write the Shadow movie magazine.
Oh, okay.
So when I started, I was interviewing people like Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger. When we wrapped it up around 2008, 2009 when the magazine went out of business, I was interviewing Keanu Reeves and Hugh Jackman.
Oh.
So it was a big generational change of action heroes. And, you know, I interviewed a lot of people, had a lot of fun. I went to Prague 3 times, 2 times. I went to Mexico City 3 times. I went to Vancouver 10 times. I went to Canada, Deep South, I went to Yuma, Arizona, out in the desert there for Rambo 3, where they were just blowing stuff up everywhere, helicopters and tanks. A lot of them were outdoor shoots. So I did that for almost 30 years.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, I covered a lot of film. Well, you know, I don't talk about it here because it's not what this group talks about.
Well,
but basically, I was, you know, I guess you'd say an entertainment journalist in the sense as I interviewed a lot of famous people all over the world. And I had a good time doing it. And the benefit was that all this travel fed into my novels.
Okay.
Like when I went to London, I would write a story set in London. When I went to Yuma, Arizona, there was a situation where I was interviewing Sylvester Stallone, and he told me of what he had to do to get AK-47s imported into this country legally. He had to go to Congress so he could get Soviet weaponry into this country for the shoot. And I thought, well, you know, if a bad guy wanted to take over a piece of America and he needed the weaponry, operating under the guise of a movie might be a way to do it. So I did one of my most famous destroyers using a Sylvester Stallone type of character as being the guy importing all this weaponry, and he doesn't know the people financing the movie are trying to finance an attack on the U.S. It's going to be an attack from within. So you get ideas as well as locales. And so I did that for 30 years, and I wrote 40 destroyers. Not all of them were inspired by my travels, but a good number of them were.
Yeah. Wow.
You didn't
That's
know that?
amazing. I did not know that.
No,
I'm learning a lot today.
I guess you are.
So let's talk about what everybody is very excited about at this PulpFest, which is Master of Mystery, The Rise of the Shadow, and I hear that you've already sold out.
Here. I brought hardcovers, I brought soft covers. I didn't bring enough. There's no way to know. Because a lot of people have been ordering it online. It's only been out for a few weeks, but I've been selling a lot of copies online and through Amazon, so I don't know that how many people just rushed out to mail order it. Why would you waste your money at PulpFest on something like this when you could buy some old pulps?
Yeah,
anyway.
That is a great piece with a lot of information in there that people are going to...
What happened with this book was interesting. People have been asking me to do two things. To reprint my old Duende History of the Shadow, which I published in 1980, which is a history of the Shadow Pulp magazine with some articles and interviews. And they also wanted me to reprint the best of my Sanctum Books articles, which accompanied the Sanctum Books Shadow reprints. I'm not that interested in reprinting old stuff if I can put the energy into new stuff, but people kept asking, and the original Duende History is, 40 years old now, so I guess maybe it could be updated. So about 4 years ago, we started to update the book, and we had Joe DeVito, commissioned by Tim Kames in the back there, paint this cover for the cover, and we hit a couple snags. One is, I stupidly sent the PDF to Condé Nast just for their information and approval, and they decided, well, that's a licensed book, we don't want you publishing it. I got really mad. So we had some discussions, and I put the book aside for a while. So I got to figure this out, because it's not a licensed book. This is reprints of my old stuff.
Yeah.
But we had to be in their good graces because we have other licenses with them. So when I got that other stuff cleared away, I said to Matt Mooring, who designs these books for me, let's add some more stuff. I'm going to go ahead with this. I'm just going to figure out how to do it. So we built the book up into a much bigger compendium of articles than it originally was going to be. And when we did that, it was so big. I said, it's going to be a $50 book. I said, I don't know if we should do a $50 book. I don't know if I would have put that kind of, price on a book, even if it's a book people are asking for and will probably sell. I said, this is a little bit much. A couple of interesting things happened. One is I got in touch with an artist named Colton Worley, who's done a lot of shadow paintings that are really nice. This is one of them, the back cover of the book. And I said, I'd like to use one of your images on the back cover of my book that I'm planning. And he said, well, I have 10 of them.
Yeah.
I'll sell you all of them, and I said, I don't need all, but maybe this is opening up ideas. And at the same time that was happening, I was talking to Condé Nast and saying, I'm going ahead with this book. And they said, well, maybe we want to work with you on this book. And I said, well, I don't know, I'm already it's designed, and I thought about it. And I said, I got all this art, and the book is too big. Maybe it's 2 books.
Oh.
Maybe it's 2 cheaper books. And one of the big expenses of a book is cover art. Mm-hmm. And if you have the cover art and it didn't break your bank, it's like, yeah, there's 2 books there, maybe 3 if I dig out every shadow article I ever wrote that's worth reprinting. I don't know if I'd do that, but it's a thought. So I said to Condé Nast, tell you what, if you want to take the part of this book that's the most professional and most commercial, we can talk about that. I'm going to take the stuff that I think makes a good volume 1, and I'm going to publish it. And so fine, that's where we did. So this is not the revised Duende history. This is a compilation of a long article on the history of the shadow on radio, which I've updated meticulously since I first wrote it. 2 interviews with Walter Gibson, 1 interview with Ted Tinsley, his ghostwriter, interviews with 2 of the artists, including Ed Cartier, who almost never gave interviews, a couple of articles on Gibson an article on how Batman was inspired by the Shadow, and some other stuff. And it's a nice, thick, but not too thick volume. And I needed permission from Condé Nast to reproduce some Ed Cartier art, and it was a good thing I did that, because they asked me to tell them what the title of the book is so they could write a letter of permission. They came back to me and said, "Well, you're calling it the Shadow Compendium. It sounds like a licensed book." Well, here we are again. Mm-hmm. And he said, "Can you change the title?" I said, "Yeah, okay." I called it the Shadow Compendium because that's what it was, a compendium of shadow articles. I wasn't in love with the title, but now there was a gun to my head. We were trying to get the book out for PulpFest. So I said, okay, let me come up with some other titles. I came up with a bunch, and this is the one I liked, Master of Mystery, The Rise of the Shadow.
It's a great title.
And I remember thinking, I'm glad they objected. This is a better title.
It's a better title.
I wasn't doing my due diligence on thinking about what best title, because I wanted the title to honestly reflect what the book was. It's a compendium. It's reprints. Expanded reprints. I rewrote everything, but they're reprints. So we got a better title, and then the next volume, whoever does it, will be Dark Avenger, The Strange Saga of the Shadow.
What do you mean, whoever does it?
Well, if Condé Nast wants to put it out into the marketplace in partnership with me to a major publisher, I'm willing to look at that.
Okay.
If they don't, it'll be volume 2.
Okay.
And even if they do, I still have a lot of articles on the Shadow in comics, other articles on the Shadow, and other interviews that can go into a volume 3, which might be called The Legend of the Shadow. So there might be 3 books here if the audience is willing to see all this stuff collected. As a writer, I'm more interested in the future than the past. But some of these interviews and articles go back to 1975. That's a long time ago. And they're in fanzines you can't get anymore, in magazines that are tough to find. So yeah, having it all in one place is actually, there's a demand for that. And I knew that because people were asking me to do it. I just didn't take it as seriously as I should have, because I got a spider to write, and I want to do this, and I want to do that, and I want to do this other new thing. So here we are. Sold out, but it's on Amazon, it's on my website.
Okay, that was my next question, is for...
The soft cover's on Amazon, the soft and hardcover is on my website. Hardcover is exclusive with me. We'll do an ebook probably in September, October. So it'll be available in ebook eventually.
Okay.
But it's, people like it. They're happy with it. It's already gotten some good reviews. Glad I did it. I'm glad I didn't do a $50 book, because I think it was just too much.
Yeah.
It'd be a great book. If you're willing to spend $50 to have something like this. Yeah, but I think people like the collectible idea of, well, there's a volume 1 and there's a volume 2 and there's different cover art, and
right.
I can use that cover art. And I think people like the idea that even after I read it, it sits on my shelf and I like looking at it, because that's how I am with books. And also we got rights to reprint some Frank Hamilton art, who's been deceased over a long time now. And I used to work with him. And what we did with this book that was different than other books is it's illustrated. Colton Worley did some interior illustrations. We got some photographs of the shadow actors. And we've got a lot of Frank Hamilton art as frontispieces. And there was so much of it on the Shadow, we said, well, there's enough to fill this book up, but also do the next volume. It's like we got all this, the art made it possible to rethink this book as this isn't a book, this is a couple of books, and maybe 3 books, but they'll be illustrated books. They'll be enjoyable on a level other than just, here's a whole bunch of reprints and interviews.
Right.
So I hope people are going to keep buying this, because I think it's a great book. And I revived my old publishing name, Odyssey Publications, for this book, because they published the original Duende history, which I was a part of back in those days.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I'm about done with questions. I wanted to leave enough time for audience questions, so...
And this, by the way, is the cover painting to Empire of Doom, my second Doc Savage Meets the Shadow novel. Tim King once again commissioned that painting. Originally, it was going to be a wraparound, and my contract was coming to an end, and the book had to be finished and published, at least as a proof, by December 31st of that year, which I think was 2016 or 17. And there wasn't time for Joe DeVito to paint the full wraparound, so we cut it, you know, and said, well, you know, as long as we have the front cover, we're all set, you know.
Okay, great. So I want to open it up to the audience. Questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, do you ever consider doing a Doc Savage type of book like you just did for the national industry?
Yeah, I not only have I considered it, but it's probably something I should have done a while ago because I have a lot of Doc Savage. But the thing about Doc Savage I most want to do is I started a biography of Lester Dent, and I really want to finish that. The problem I've had with that is most commercial publishing houses don't know who he is. You know, but if there's a movie or a TV show, that the equation changes. So I'm trying to get that finished so that if I can't get a major publisher interested, we can do it, and at least can be published. But a collection of my Doc Savage articles is also something that's probably, you know, I really should get around to doing it. Although sometimes I think it might be better to do it, because I already did a collection of my Doc Savage articles called Writings in Bronze. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Okay, if you look up Writings in Bronze by Will Murray, it's a collection of my Doc Savage articles. Not all of them, but it's a lot. It's a huge book.
Yeah.
Okay, I keep forgetting to bring it to the convention because technically my co-publisher published it, not me. But I actually done that. It was about 12 years ago, and but there's a lot more that hasn't been reprinted. So what I've been thinking of, maybe I should do a book of just general pulp articles, including Doc in the Shadow, and not just limited to one character. But that book is out there. You know, you can get it, Writings in Bronze, you know. It's huge. I don't know how many articles in it, but I think there's like 30, maybe more, maybe 50. Some of them are long, some of them are short, but you know, we put a lot into that.
Thanks.
Nick?
I just read your Skull Island and Tarzan book. You write so cinematically. Is there any movie possibilities? I mean, your stuff is literally shot for shot.
Yeah, well, I write visually and, you know, clearly, I hope, and entertainingly. The issue with that is, of course, there's two copyright owners for the characters. And, you know, both Edgar Rice Burroughs and Condé Nast would probably want, because of the money involved, a pure Doc Savage movie or a pure King, actually that's King Kong, so it's the Marion C. Cooper people. I think the Marion C. Cooper people would be more open to it than the Condé Nast, because they don't want to split the money, but it would be a hell of a movie, you know. It's just that, you know, people, even a big pie, people don't like, corporations don't like splitting a big pie.
Even if it means losing half of
Yeah, it's amazing to me. But, you know, if you think of it their way, if they have a chance of getting a Doc Savage movie out, that's the whole pie. It's theirs. This thing here, they might think, well, it's a great idea, it'd make a good movie, it'll probably be successful, but we're splitting the pie and we're sharing oversight. You know, we've got to agree to the filmmaker's view of Doc Savage, and the Cooper people have to agree to their view of King Kong. And so it can get complicated, but, you know, never say never. You know, if someone wants to do it and can offer enough money and get everybody in line, yeah, it could happen. I'm not holding my breath. You know, it's not why I write books, you know, but it could happen. You know, all you need is the right people with their heads on straight to say, this could make a lot of money. You know, no one's ever done anything like this before. Because a lot of the King Kong Meets movies the early ones are just clownish. You know, they're of their time. And now we're having King Kong Meets Godzilla. That's a bigger deal. It's done more intelligently, I hope. but it's still not the same as King Kong meets a different kind of hero. You know, King Kong meets Tarzan is a great idea, but you got to figure out how to do it so that it works as a story. King Kong meets Doc Savage, you got to figure out, well, what's the story that brings them together, that makes it work, that doesn't make it a joke.
Anybody else?
Well, could you tell me how the Assassin's Handbook came about?
Well, there's a funny story there. What happened was that when I first came I interviewed Saper and Murphy for Media Scene Preview, whatever it was then. They never published it. They wanted Pinnacle, who was the publisher of the Destroyer novels, to take out advertising, and Pinnacle didn't want to do that, so they held on to the interview. Well, I shared this interview with Saper and Murphy, and they loved it. And they said, we could build a book around this. And they had the Executioner series, which is also Pinnacle. There was an Executioner war book, and it sold. So they thought, what could we do with the Destroyer? The Assassin's Handbook. The Destroyer, for those who don't know, was Remo Williams and Sean. They made a movie about it a zillion years ago, Remo Williams, The Adventure Begins. That's the first movie I ever covered. So they got this idea for the Assassin's Handbook. And the idea was that everybody involved would write a piece. And I had written the interview. Somehow that turned into, Will, you write it, and we'll edit it, and we'll add stuff, and we'll subtract stuff. So I wrote this ginormous manuscript and sent it to Warren Murphy, who said, okay, don't send it to Dick Saper. But Dick Saper lived in my neck of the woods, and I met him, and we became friendly. And Dick called me one day, I want to see the manuscript. And I couldn't say no to him. You know, I mean, it's just, we're friends. So I sent it to him, and of course, Warren wanted to edit it one way, and Dick wanted to edit the other way, and Dick ripped stuff out and put stuff in, and did all sorts of stuff. So the book that came out wasn't exactly the book I wrote, but then again, I wrote so much that there was stuff you could throw out and still have a big book. So it became the Assassin's Handbook. I don't think that was the original title. And it was published as an oversized trade paperback, and they thought it would do real well, but not long after that, Pinnacle went out of business. And so there went the royalties. When I think Harlequin took over, no, it wasn't Harlequin, it was some, NAL, when they took over, they brought it back as Inside Sin and Jew, a much smaller book, or at least a paperback-sized book. And then they lost the rights and Harlequin took over. So the book kept getting kicked around and Harlequin didn't want to bring it back. But that's the story of the Assassin's Handbook. It was quite the undertaking. But I was glad I did it. It was an interesting book. You know, people loved it. Just that, you know, it was a weird size and price for something like that initially, and then Pinnacle went out of business and kind of killed the potential to keep it in print.
How many books did you do, and what were the numbers?
My first one was number 56, Encounter Group, and then I started doing them regularly with 69, Blood Ties, and I did them right up to the last one I wrote from scratch was 105, 6, 7, Feast or Famine. So I did 40, you know, over slightly more than a 10-year period of time.
Amazing. In the back?
You've got so many books written. What is your writing day like?
Well, it's chaotic, you know, because I'm not just writing novels, I'm writing short stories, do interviews, whatever. I try to write something every day I possibly can without killing myself. I do a lot of rewriting. I compose fairly quickly. I work in spurts. I tend to write more in the evening. I lose a lot of time during the day because I just have to kind of mentally gear myself to do certain kinds of writing. Fiction writing, I have to really gear myself up to. Non-fiction, I can write any old time, usually, if I have the mindset to do it, the energy. But I don't have a set writing schedule, except the heaviest writing is done in the evening.
I wonder why.
Probably because I'm a night person more than a day
Oh, okay.
person. Go ahead.
Well, what's the possibility of, I know you said you had 2 more Doc Savage stories coming,
In my head, yeah.
in your head. What's the possibilities of that?
I don't think they're great right now, but I also feel like there's an argument to be made that if you're going to do an updated Doc Savage for the mass market, which might or might not be successful with James Patterson, it's really smart to keep the original character alive in some way for, if no other reason, for just safety reasons. Because what if, this first Shadow novel is not well received at all, that James Patterson did with a co-author. I don't know what the Doc Savage novel will be like. There's no way to tell because we don't know who's going to co-write it. But, if these things flop, you don't want to lose the original Doc Savage as a valuable property because, they're going to make a Doc Savage movie. They're still going to probably go to the original Doc Savage. They might update them. They might not go for the new Doc Savage that will be updated because we don't know who he is yet or how popular he's going to be or how well accepted he's going to be. Shadow was a very simple character. I don't know how they screwed it up. Doc Savage is a little more complicated character and it's easier to mess up. So I have my fingers crossed that they can at least do a Doc Savage novel that captures the spirit of Doc Savage. But right now it's not feeling all that wonderful.
Well, we've got a few more minutes left. Any more questions?
Who's the character that you want to write that you haven't yet?
Probably a Robert E. Howard character like Conan the Barbarian or Solomon Kane. Because, they were among the first things I read after I got into Burroughs and Doc Savage. And I like his writing style. I think it would be a challenge to write it. I think Conan's an interesting character. Solomon Kane's an interesting character. King Kull's an interesting character. And that would interest me because it would be in the pulp vein, but also, something I haven't done before in a style I haven't worked in. Because when I was first writing, I wrote stories that I wouldn't market, but I was very influenced by Howard. I just didn't write necessarily Howard kind of stories. I just liked his style and his approach. So he was a major influence. I write Lovecraft stories for anthologies, I like that, but I've done a bunch of them now. But I think it would be any one of Robert E. Howard's major characters would probably be the most appealing to me right now. There isn't much else that I either haven't done or maybe I might have outgrown, I don't know.
Breckenridge Elkins?
That would be fun, but I wouldn't do a novel. I would do a short story. I don't know that I could sustain that style over a novel, and I'm not sure I can sustain that style in a short story. I have to reread them.
Who was this again?
Breckenridge Elkins was one of Robert E. Howard's
Oh, okay.
Western characters, a humorous character, and a lot of fun. So much successful that E. Hoffman Price kind of borrowed the idea and did his own version for many years. His name is, I wrote an article on this once, and I can't remember the guy's name, but very popular character, very, very nice stories. But I don't know that I would do Breckenridge Elkins. I think Conan or somebody like that would be more to my taste. But it would be a good challenge. It would be something that, if someone said, I want you to do it, I don't think I'd say no. I'd say, all right, let me reread those stories and see what I can do.
Well, I think we're up. Time's up. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much, Will. That was
You're welcome.
very
That was
interesting.
painless. Thank you. Thanks for your support.
You've been listening to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines for over 25 years. Please visit us online at thepulp.net. Also, look for the PulpNet on Facebook and on Twitter. Thank you for listening, and keep reading the Pulps. The Pulp Event podcast is copyright 2021.